Because he arrived just 2 minutes late for work, the boss publicly announced he would lose his entire $50,000 annual bonus. He tried to explain that the machine hadn't been repaired the night before and he had stayed working until 3 in the morning. But the man simply scolded him for making excuses. To be honest, it was a rather heartless display. He didn't want to argue anymore, so he simply began to work with a quiet, passive resignation. As a result, in less than a month, the factory machine broke down at midnight and no one could fix it. The company lost $100 million. On Monday morning, he felt surprisingly good about that, which, naturally, was quite understandable. We see him earlier, having just finished repairing machine number 3 during the night shift. The machine finally stopped making those strange noises, and as he watched the data stabilize, his entire body finally began to relax. It had been a long night, after all. Dragging his feet, he returned to the dormitory, realizing just how late it had become. While lying in bed, he told himself that if he could just endure this month and receive his year-end bonus, the money for his father's dialysis would be secured. It was a heavy burden for one man to carry. It would also cover the costs for his wife's second child and their New Year's expenses. It would be enough. He had no idea that when the alarm finally rang and he opened his eyes, everything would fall apart. In reality, he was only 2 minutes late. He had been running at full speed when he burst through the factory doors. The time clock ruthlessly displayed 8:02, a perfectly ordinary mistake with extraordinary consequences. He felt a small click in his heart. In that moment, he knew he was finished. He was certain he would be scolded again. He assumed, at worst, the boss would just yell at him. He had no way of knowing that his manager, Charlie, was about to deliver a devastating blow. At the morning meeting, over 100 workers were crowded into the workshop with the machines standing silent. The air was thick with the pungent scent of machine oil, mixed with the sharp smell of harsh industrial detergent. It was an oppressive atmosphere. Charlie stood at the front, clutching a stack of papers in his hand. With a pale, livid face, he made a show of clearing his throat to command the room. Glancing sideways toward our protagonist, he announced that he had an important matter to address first. He claimed that some people, relying on their status as senior employees, had become far too arrogant. A coworker whispered to Leo that it certainly felt like the manager was pointing directly at him. Because Leo arrived 2 minutes late for work, Charlie declared that according to the strict company regulations, the entirety of his $50,000 year-end bonus would be deducted immediately. The entire workshop fell into a heavy silence, and Leo felt a sudden, sharp ringing in his ears. He was completely stunned. 50,000 might be nothing to the wealthy, but to him, it was everything. This was the money that kept his father alive every quarter. To be honest, it was his only lifeline. It was meant for his wife's hospital fees for their second child's birth, and it represented the entire family's hope for the coming new year. He had worked himself to the bone for a year. His monthly salary alone was never quite enough. He had been looking forward to this money to finally give his family some relief. The workers in the back took a collective breath. Losing 50,000 for being 2 minutes late. It was so harsh that they wondered how he would survive the year. They all worked hard, yet it was never enough. Some muttered that it was just for a small salary, while others whispered it was his own fault for being late. There were even those in the crowd who seemed to take a quiet, cruel pleasure in his misfortune. Leo's throat felt bone dry, as if it had been stuffed with cotton. He couldn't find a single word to say. Leo took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of his strength just to force out a few strained words. He explained to Charlie that machine number 3 had suffered a sudden circuit failure the night before. He had stayed behind, working tirelessly to repair the damage until 3 in the morning. After finally closing his eyes for a brief moment of rest, he simply didn't hear his alarm. That was the only reason he was 2 minutes late, a small lapse after a night of selfless labor. He hadn't even found the time to eat breakfast, and his stomach was still growling with hunger. Charlie didn't even bother to look up, continuing to scan the list in his hand with cold indifference. He told Leo that working overtime was his own problem, but being late was a clear violation. Rules are rules, after all, and he insisted it was impossible to make an exception for him. Leo argued that without his late-night repairs, machine number 3 wouldn't even be running today. The entire production line would have ground to a halt, but Charlie responded by slamming his hand on the table. The sudden noise was so sharp that a worker in the front row couldn't help but flinch. Charlie barked at Leo, asking if he really dared to talk back after committing such an error. He reminded him that as a senior employee, he was expected to set an example and follow the regulations. If he started showing up late, Charlie argued, the entire team's discipline would eventually crumble. He asked if the company rules were just for show, and Leo felt his face burn with public humiliation. He had dedicated 5 full years of his life to this place, giving them his best years. As a junior team leader, he had earned a certain level of respect, or so he thought. Yet here was his manager, refusing to give him even a shred of dignity in front of his peers. Behind them, the other workers couldn't help but whisper as they watched the scene unfold. The truth was, he had actually worked until midnight the previous evening. Our colleagues from the professional shift had even seen him climbing down from the machine. But what did that matter? To Charlie, the rules were simply whatever he decided they were. Upon hearing the quiet murmurs of dissent from below, Charlie flew into a rage. He immediately issued a harsh ultimatum. From this moment on, no one was to intercede for Leo. Anyone who tried would be punished alongside him, with a $50,000 fine as a warning to the rest. He demanded to know who else would dare to show up late from now on. They would be punished by this same standard, he declared, after dropping those heavy words. Everyone was terrified, their eyes fixed firmly on the tips of their own shoes. They hardly dared to breathe, for fear of drawing his ire and getting into trouble. Leo grit his teeth tightly, his palms slick with a cold, nervous sweat. His chest felt as though a heavy stone were sitting on it, blocking his breath and causing him deep distress. He didn't want to deny his mistake, but this public humiliation was a bitter pill he simply couldn't swallow. As he looked at Charlie's face, glowing with the smug satisfaction of a small triumph, Leo suddenly understood one thing with absolute, chilling clarity. In the eyes of men like Charlie, the years of life he had sold and the sleepless nights he had endured, and even the machines he had painstakingly repaired, weren't worth a single cent. To them, he was nothing more than a feelingless clock-in machine. As long as he failed to register his time, he was expected to be sacrificed obediently. Beside him, an old colleague named Ben secretly nudged him with his elbow, urging him to stay silent. Ben whispered urgently, begging Leo to just apologize, since $50,000 was an impossible sum to lose. Leo took a deep breath, forcing back the words about how unfair this all was before they could escape his lips. He simply adjusted his helmet and, turning toward Charlie, flashed a cold, hollow smile. Instead of his usual defiance, he calmly told Charlie that there was no problem at all. He agreed to follow every word of the order, leaving Charlie momentarily frozen in place by the sudden compliance. To be honest, Charlie hadn't expected the stubborn man to become so submissive so quickly. With an arrogant snort, Charlie dropped the list and declared the meeting over, sending everyone back to their posts. The workers scattered instantly, moving like ants fleeing from a boiling pot to escape the tension. Some deliberately kept their distance, as if Leo's misfortune might be contagious if they stood too close. Others approached to give him a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, telling him to just accept it as bad luck. They wondered why he had dared to stand his ground at all, while Leo remained silent and retreated. He headed toward machine number 3, his steps feeling as heavy as lead as his mind began to wander. He remembered the previous night, curled up alone on the cold cement floor during his break. His arm had brushed against the scalding machine, leaving the back of his hand red and blistered. Yet he hadn't even dared to stop for a sip of water, despite his throat feeling like sandpaper. At that hour, while everyone else was sound asleep, he had been the only one foolish enough to stay. He had worried about delaying the next day's work, pushing himself to the limit to finish the repairs overnight. Looking back, it really did seem like a foolish waste of effort, standing there in someone else's massive workshop. He reached out and touched the metal casing, which was still slightly warm from his long hours of labor. This old machine had been his focus since the day the outer plating first began to peel away. It was through his own tireless efforts alongside the foreign engineers that he came to understand the machine's temperament. Learning how to adjust every tiny detail, from the way a bearing vibrated to the smallest mechanical quirk. He knew exactly which gear was making an unusual sound the moment the motor started up. He could locate and fix any issue with absolute precision, even with his eyes closed. For years, whenever the machine ground to a halt, everyone's instinctive reaction was to act quickly. Their first thought was always to go find Leo, even if he was fast asleep at 2 in the morning. One single phone call was enough to make him get up and rush to the workshop without a second thought. And what did he get in return? Simply because of a measly 2-minute delay, $50,000 of his own blood, sweat, and tears had completely evaporated. In an instant, his entire family's livelihood for the year had been unceremoniously cut off. He couldn't help but shake his head with a bitter smile, realizing that his ridiculous sense of dedication had been crushed underfoot. Ben watched him, standing as still as a wooden post, before quickly approaching to ask him a question in a low, hushed voice. He asked Leo if he could truly stomach such an insult without a fight. He wondered if Leo should go to the big boss himself to plead for some mercy. Leo shook his head decisively, knowing there was no point in trying to reason with people like that. When asked what he would do now, he simply straightened the ID badge pinned to his chest. He picked up a wrench and asked what else he could possibly do in this situation. From now on, he decided, they would do things strictly by the rules. Ben looked on, utterly confused, not quite understanding what it meant to simply follow the established schedule. He decided he would leave the very moment his shift ended, without a second's delay. Once his work was done, he felt that working even 1 extra second would be a personal loss. Ben stood there in stunned silence for a few moments, processing this new reality. He asked Leo if he wasn't the same man who used to arrive 30 minutes early every day to check the lines. Leo replied that those were the days before he started thinking clearly. From now on, that man who worked for free could be replaced by anyone else who wanted the job, starting right this second. A new plan had taken firm root in his heart. He would stay quiet, cause no trouble, and avoid any arguments. And most importantly, he had absolutely no intention of resigning on his own initiative. He would simply do exactly what was written, following the employment contract to the very letter. Since the company wanted to treat people like cold, unfeeling machines, he would oblige them. If they wanted a mindless bolt in the gears, then he would be the most honest, useless iron bolt they had ever seen. he would earn exactly what he was owed. He wouldn't even bother working toward a pension anymore. As for that precious machine number 3 and the entire production line he once cared for, if they were to grind to a complete halt, he would leave that for the factory director to worry about. The moment the exit bell rang, we see him drop his tools and sprint 100 meters at full speed, racing toward the time clock to punch out as quickly as humanly possible. To him, staying even a minute longer in that factory now felt like a tragic waste of his life. The following morning, as the magnetic card reader counted down the final 3 seconds, he rushed into the work area at a full run, watching the clock flash a triumphant green light. Deep down, he couldn't help but feel a sudden, irrepressible urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The fool who used to arrive 30 minutes early and work for free was officially gone. Now, the only thing that truly mattered to Leo was the difference of a few seconds. We see Ben watching him from a distance, clearly concerned for his friend. He asked Leo if he had finally snapped or if he was just planning to take it easy. Leo simply shrugged, noting that the boss insisted they follow the rules to the letter. He was merely being a model employee by strictly complying with those very regulations. After saying that, he deliberately slowed his pace to a crawl. He walked with more relaxation than a retiree taking a Sunday stroll through the park. As he reached the center of the workshop, he ran right into the factory director, Mr. Chan. The director looked at him as if he were seeing a ghost, or perhaps something worse. With a grim face, the director stared him down, while Leo felt a cold smile in his heart. This is how the honest are treated after being exploited like workhorses for so long. It was a bad habit, really, arriving early every day and working hard without a break. Now that he was punching in exactly on time, it was treated like a crime against nature. Mr. Chan remarked dryly that Leo was being quite punctual with the clock today. Leo calmly asked if everything wasn't strictly following the factory's own rules. The director was instantly choked up, unable to find a retort, his usual arrogance faltering. As the morning meeting began, Mr. Chan kept shooting daggers at Leo with his eyes. Leo stood there as still as a wooden post, refusing to volunteer any reports on the equipment. Since he wasn't taking the initiative like before, the director's expression turned even uglier. In truth, we see that those who exploit others are often insatiable, always wanting more than they give. To them, if they aren't squeezing out every drop of profit, they feel as though they're suffering a great loss. When the director announced the meeting was over, he deliberately dragged out his words, waiting for a reaction. He barked at everyone to disperse, return to their stations, and get to work as quickly as possible. With those pointed words, it was clear he was testing the waters to see how Leo would react. He was waiting to see if Leo would stay behind like a loyal dog and volunteer for unpaid overtime. Instead, Leo simply turned on his heel and walked away without giving the man a single glance. His friend Ben followed close behind, doing his absolute best to stifle a laugh at the director's face. Ben whispered that Leo had done a fantastic job by finally standing up for himself like that. Leo merely shrugged with indifference, knowing that if he didn't teach them a lesson now, they would truly believe he was just a free repairman available to them 24 hours a day. To be honest, a fire was still burning in his chest, but the more frustrated he felt deep down, the more strictly he intended to follow every single word written in his employment contract. He needed to open their eyes and show them that without him clearing away the daily hazards, this broken-down factory wouldn't even be able to function. A bold claim, perhaps, but accurate. And, as we might have expected, less than half an hour after he sat back down at his desk, machine number 3 began to act up again, causing chaos on the floor. The speed of the conveyor belt slowed down so visibly that even a casual observer could see the problem. The new apprentice panicked as the belt stalled. He went blank and began frantically poking at the control panel. He cursed under his breath, wondering why on earth the alarm was going off yet again. "What are you touching?" the supervisor barked. "Go quickly and find Leo so he can help us." The young apprentice spun around frantically in search of help, while we see that Leo, meanwhile, was standing calmly by his toolbox, perfectly unbothered by the growing commotion. As he slowly selected the right wrench, the manager, Charlie, ran out of the office with a grim face. "What is happening?" Charlie demanded. "Why has the production line slowed down again?" One of the workers muttered that Leo usually checked the machines well in advance to prevent this. Now, it seemed, Leo simply hadn't bothered to look for the problem yet. Upon hearing this, Charlie looked as though he might actually explode with rage right then and there. He was the team leader. After all, if he didn't care, the entire production line would suffer. Hearing the shouting, Leo simply tossed his wrench onto the table and spread his hands wide. "Charlie, during working hours, I do my job," he said with a calm that was almost insulting. He pointed out that if they insisted he work before his shift, it would count as overtime. Charlie stammered that Leo never used to have such an attitude about coming in early to help. Leo reminded him that things were different now, especially since Charlie had insisted rules were everything. If it wasn't officially time to work yet, why on earth should he touch the machinery? To do so would be to knowingly violate the company rules, and we know how much Charlie loves rules. Instantly, a deathly silence fell over the factory floor as everyone watched the confrontation. They all expected Charlie to blow a fuse, but he remained uncharacteristically speechless for a long moment. He could only grit his teeth in silence, leaving the foreman to continue spiraling into desperation. In less than 10 minutes, machine number 3 suddenly let out a loud, heavy thud. The entire workshop floor shuddered under the impact. Beside him, the young apprentice was trembling with pure terror. Leo, he stopped the machine himself, the boy stammered, barely able to find his voice. As for Charlie, his face turned a shade of pale that was almost impressive, white as a sheet of paper. He knew exactly what it meant for this specific machine to break down at this specific moment. The entire production line ground to a halt, and their output was instantly cut in half. Every single order they had scheduled for the day was now completely ruined. Charlie turned and screamed at him frantically, asking Leo if he found the situation funny. He demanded that Leo come over and fix it immediately, his voice cracking under the pressure. Leo calmly replied that he wasn't on strike, but he suggested that Charlie stop shouting at him. Deep down, Leo didn't care at all. Nearby, old Ben was doing his absolute best not to laugh out loud. The effort of holding back his amusement was so great that Ben's shoulders were visibly shaking. He whispered to Leo, wondering if he was trying to give the manager a literal brain hemorrhage. Charlie's face cycled through shades of white and green before he finally, painfully, swallowed his rage. Leo, he managed to squeeze out, please, just come and take a look at it. Only then did Leo give a reluctant nod, leaning over to stick his head into the guts of the machine. In just 2 minutes, he had located the exact point of failure. Efficiency can be a beautiful thing. The drive belt had gone slack and slipped right out of its groove, causing the mechanical heart attack. It had actually snapped during the rushed emergency repairs they had performed just yesterday. The parts needed replacing, but the higher-ups had refused to approve the purchase to save a few pennies. And today, under the strain of high-speed operation, that hidden threat finally exploded on the spot. He stood up and wiped the thick grease from his hands with a practiced motion. Charlie, I told you yesterday that these parts needed to be replaced, Leo reminded him. He noted that it wasn't his fault the request wasn't approved, as dozens of eyes across the workshop turned toward Charlie. Those silent stares were sending a very clear message. Well, let's see it. We can almost hear them wondering how he would shift the blame this time, as Charlie's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Charlie insisted he fix it quickly, but Leo warned that without new parts, he could only manage a temporary patch. How long that patch would actually hold, he added, was entirely a matter of luck. Charlie begged him to just make it hold for now, otherwise, the entire day's production would be a total loss. Leo didn't hesitate any longer. He tightened the belt with force, though deep down, he knew this broken machine was a ticking time bomb. In the past, he would have inspected it 8 times a day just to prevent this exact disaster. After finishing the repair, he wiped the black oil from his hands and prepared to move on. He turned to leave, casually mentioning to Charlie that he was heading to the restroom. Charlie's eyes nearly popped out of his head in sheer disbelief at the timing. He stammered that Leo had just been there, but Leo simply met his gaze with a cold, steady look. He reminded the manager that $50,000 had been cut from his year-end bonus. Didn't you say I should follow the rules? Leo asked. I'm just taking a standard, regulated break. He wondered aloud if the company rules had suddenly evolved to forbid basic human biology. Charlie found himself utterly speechless, unable to muster even half a word in response. All around them, his co-workers on the production line were doing their absolute best to stifle their laughter. Their faces were turning purple from the effort, but to be honest, they hadn't felt this satisfied in years. From this second onward, we see that things are going to become a very big problem. He decided he wouldn't show any more consideration, choosing instead to act ruthlessly by the rules. If they wouldn't show him any respect, he told himself, then no one was going to have a good day. To be perfectly honest, the capitalist in charge had made a massive mistake this time. He hadn't picked on a soft target who could be easily manipulated, but a man who held the core technology. This was definitely the single greatest error the manager had ever made in his life. After all, who was it that said the entire production line couldn't function without him? As the workday finally drew to a close, Leo knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was the very first person to bolt out of the workshop, moving like an arrow shot from a bow. Someone called out, asking if he was skipping overtime, while the machine's hidden threat remained unresolved. His senior apprentice, a burly man, watched as Leo shot out of the building without looking back. Leo couldn't help but feel that anyone staying behind was simply lacking a bit of common sense. He knew that if he left late, there wouldn't even be leftovers waiting for him in the cafeteria, and he would be forced to eat nothing but instant noodles yet again. He decided that whoever wanted to work themselves to the bone like an ox was welcome to it. To hell with the fake loyalty of extra work. Those were his final thoughts on the matter. He had already reached the time clock, firmly securing the very first green light of the evening, leaving work exactly on time. It was, in his mind, the basic dignity every worker deserves. Looking back, he felt as though he must have been completely out of his mind before. He used to stay behind with the machines long after his shift ended, but those days were over. Deep down, he used to fear that leaving early might somehow affect the perfection of the next day's work. He had always felt that putting in a little extra effort was simply his duty as a craftsman. Overtime and sleepless nights didn't seem to matter back then, as long as the job was done. But in the end, he would go to the cafeteria every single day only to find himself sighing in disappointment. He eventually had to use his own meager savings to buy instant noodles just to survive the week. Now, however, we see that he is finally wide awake. Working twice as hard never earned him a single thank you. Yet, being just 2 minutes late could somehow erase an entire year of hard work in the manager's eyes. It was simply outrageous. His $5,000 bonus had vanished, and he was tired of pretending to be okay with it. As night fell, he knew he had to find a way to secure some extra income to support his family. He just needed a few hundred more to keep their heads above water and maintain their livelihood. He pulled a secret number from his phone, the contact for their main competitor, a man named William. He recalled William's previous offer to have him come over and fix their machinery. He called to ask if they still needed help, and the voice on the other end was instantly filled with joy. The man was so enthusiastic he sounded as if he wanted to send a cup of tea right through the phone line. The offer was the usual rate, 400 per hour. The question was, would Leo take it? He did a quick calculation in his head, wondering if he could push for 500 instead. He made his demand, and the other side went silent for 2 long seconds. Leo thought this old fox was going to haggle, but to his surprise, the man simply agreed. William promised 500 in daily insurance, begging Leo to hurry over and rescue them. The situation at the competitor's workshop was already a total disaster, leaving Leo momentarily stunned. And suddenly, a complex wave of emotions surged through his heart. They forced him to stay awake until 3 in the morning without a single kind word. This was the old boss he had given 5 years of his life to. Taking a side job for someone else's boss felt like no problem at all now. 15 minutes later, he hung up and headed toward the small shop's entrance. An extra $300. Here he comes. $300. Yes, 300. Extra cash, and he was on his way. $300. $300. An extra 300. Here he comes. 300. $300. 300. Extra cash. Here he comes. 300. $300. 300. Extra cash. Here he comes. 300. 300. Extra dollars. Here he comes. $300. Extra. Here he comes. $300. Extra. Here he comes. $300. Extra. Here he comes. 300 extra dollars. 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 Here he comes. 3,000 extra dollars. Here he comes. 3,000 extra dollars. Here he comes. Every day, he was grateful, though he felt he should be the one saying, "Thank you." After all, he had solved a massive problem. While speaking, Mr. Wu refilled the cup with hot tea. He decided to take a walk through the workshop to prepare and change. As he spoke, he stood up. To be honest, the whole process only took him about 10 minutes. The machine only takes $2,000. He felt as though this money was burning a hole in his pocket. He couldn't even savor the good tea. He liked this kind of man who got things done. He called someone to take him away, mentioning there was a meeting and he couldn't stay. The machine depended entirely on him. After giving the instructions, Mr. Wu immediately called someone to take him directly to the workshop. He took a long walk through the floor, counting with his ears and listening to each one. He checked every single machine in operation. By then, his entire body was exhausted, having worked until 11 at night. Listening to the smooth hum of the machines throughout the workshop, his heart felt very peaceful. Only now did those $2,000 in his pocket feel truly earned. On the way back to his dorm, he stopped at a small shop and pulled out his phone, only to see the screen was filled with missed calls. They were all from his co-workers back at the factory. Just moments ago, while Charlie was repairing the machine, he had casually put his phone on silent. He opened his messages and saw they had absolutely exploded with over 99 notifications. "Brother Lee, where did you go? Machine number 3 has broken down again." The night shift crew said they couldn't even turn it on and begged him to come put out the fire quickly. The sales department was already pushing for the delivery date. The client had suddenly moved up the delivery date, and now the machine wouldn't start at all. The entire workshop had ground to a halt, and several machines were effectively on strike. The group leader was begging him to return and save them, as Mr. Wu was already furious. He was shouting in the street, launching indiscriminate verbal attacks on the entire workshop group. Charlie, however, had already finished his work and was busy picking up orders for home delivery. He responded slowly, typing out that all this nonsense would have to wait until tomorrow morning. He felt that he couldn't stay a second longer in a job that expected him to volunteer for free. By chance, he opened his next message and saw a transfer from Mr. Wu for $60,000. The message simply said, "Charlie, thank you so much for everything." Mr. Wu had just returned to the workshop and thanked him for eliminating all those hidden risks. He explained that this was an advance payment for all his hard work during the month. He insisted Charlie accept it without refusal. This boss was being truly generous for once. Charlie had assumed the earlier talk of settling accounts was just polite conversation. He was wrong. He stood there, slightly dazed, before typing back his thanks and clicking to accept the funds. We see his fingers trembling slightly as they press against the glowing phone screen. In any case, he decided that at his old company, he would definitely be leaving on time from now on. He planned to use his evening hours entirely to protect Mr. Wu's interests instead. Originally, he had been wondering if Mr. Wu's factory would be enough to keep him busy. If they didn't receive large orders, he had planned to sell his technical skills to other factories. But with the new year approaching, every production line was working harder than ever. It seemed that everywhere he looked, there was a desperate need for a true technological expert. This new structure of his life also required a great deal of hard work. He knew he could earn a lot and have a good year. Being a bit tired was a small price to pay. The only thing that truly mattered was his wallet, which would have been painfully empty for the new year. As a middle-aged man with a mortgage and a family to support, earning money was the only golden rule. He could only think of his father waiting for his medicine. He thought of his wife's belly, which was growing larger day by day. And then there were the New Year's expenses, which always seemed to flow away like water. The weight was heavy, but for the first time, he felt there was real hope. He had finally rid himself of those long nights of unpaid labor. He slept incredibly well, thinking about the mid-year bonus that Mr. Wu had previously stolen from him. He had now earned it back twice over. The frustration in his heart vanished instantly. He didn't even dream. He simply slept until the following morning. When he woke, he was once again perfectly on time, waiting for the final 3 seconds before rushing into the workplace. As he heard the signal from the control base, he slowly pulled his hand away from the scanner. And that was when we see his phone screen light up with activity. The screen was dense with unread messages and complaints from the workshop group. He simply scrolled past. He could hardly stop himself from laughing. It was over. Machine number 3 was now completely dead. The sound of the machine exploding just moments ago had been massive. It had shaken half the factory, leaving Mr. Wu standing there in his clothes at 2 in the morning. The night shift manager was scolded so relentlessly that he actually broke down in tears on the spot. Our protagonist tossed his phone back into his pocket and entered the workshop whistling a tune. He pretended to be completely bewildered, as if he had only just woken up. As he approached machine number 3, he saw a group of people gathered there, all of them frowning like vegetables withered by a sudden frost. Mr. Wu stood in the center of it all, stiff as a wooden post, his eyes bloodshot and red. He looked as though he had spent 3 straight days gambling and losing everything he owned. And that was when he finally spotted our hero, Leo, standing right there in front of him. He demanded to know where Leo had been last night while the machine sat there completely paralyzed. Leo simply pushed his helmet back, maintaining a perfectly innocent expression on his face. He calmly explained that he had finished his work on time and clocked out exactly as scheduled. He even reminded his boss that the rules were supposed to be sacred, according to Mr. Wu himself. He had merely followed those regulations to the letter, which, naturally, was the last thing the boss wanted to hear. That statement hit home immediately, leaving the boss staring back with his eyes rolling in disbelief. The man could hardly breathe, while the apprentices nearby were frantically biting their lips to stay quiet. Their shoulders were shaking with suppressed laughter, though they didn't dare utter a single word. Mr. Wu gritted his teeth, suppressing his mounting rage while wearing a grimace that looked worse than crying. He then demanded to know why Leo wasn't checking the machine right this very second. If machine number 3 wasn't running, production for the entire day would come to a complete standstill. Leo met his gaze with a cold, silent stare, offering no immediate answer to the frantic man. He asked if the worn-out material belt had been replaced with a new one, and Mr. Wu quickly looked away, playing the fool while hiding a sharp mind. Yes, it was a classic move. Leo couldn't help but let out a cold, quiet laugh at the sheer irony of it all. 2 days ago, he had reported that the drive belt was about to snap and needed replacement. The boss had refused to approve the request, and now, the entire workshop fell into a heavy silence. It was so quiet that we could have heard a pin drop on the concrete floor. Leo reminded Mr. Miller that the last time he asked for a belt, the boss claimed the budget was already exceeded. He had been told to wait until next month, a decision that was now coming back to haunt them. The silence stretched on, and Mr. Miller's face turned a sickly shade of green, like a bruised fruit. He tried to argue that a technician should always be available, but the situation was already far too dire. It was a helpless realization. Mechanical equipment is, after all, the most honest thing in the world. The boss hadn't wanted to spend a few $100s on simple spare parts. And now, he was facing hundreds of thousands in losses due to the machines sitting idle. Mr. Miller was so anxious he looked ready to jump out of his skin and start screaming. He desperately asked if there was any way to patch it up just to get it running again. The sales department was practically blowing up his phone with angry calls every few seconds. But Leo remained completely unbothered, looking down to casually clean the dirt from his fingernails. Without a hint of emotion, he simply said he couldn't work today. To be honest, who could blame him? The veins in Mr. Miller's forehead looked as though they were about to burst from the pressure. He roared, asking Leo if he actually had the audacity to say that to his face again. Leo just shrugged. Even the most skilled carpenter can't build a house without any wood. Leo asked how he was supposed to fix anything when the workshop was filled with junk they refused to replace. It seemed the only thing they were truly efficient at was finding new ways to exploit the workers. They expected everyone to keep spinning in circles to fill the gap, as if a worker's life and time were worth nothing. The shop foreman standing nearby was twitching nervously, his mouth twisting as he leaned in close. He began to whisper frantically into Mr. Miller's ear, his voice trembling with a sudden realization. He warned that this time, Leo was serious. They hadn't bought the parts, and there were simply no materials left. Even if a god descended from the heavens, there was absolutely nothing that could be done now. Mr. Miller's face instantly turned a dark, bruised purple, looking very much like fermented bamboo. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, he snapped and asked what he was supposed to do. The client was scheduled to arrive for a visit at any moment, and the timing couldn't be worse. With the machine broken, they were all facing a massive financial penalty that would ruin them. Leo simply cleared his throat and calmly stated that his technical skills weren't up to the task of repairing it. He suggested that if they had to pay the penalty, then perhaps that was just something everyone had to accept. Deep down, he was laughing. After all, that massive penalty wasn't going to be deducted from his paycheck. The boss was trying to shift the blame, and the air in the room seemed to freeze instantly. Everyone stared at Leo with wide, bulging eyes, as if they were looking at an alien from another planet. Old Man Chen's mouth twitched uncontrollably as he lowered his voice and hissed a warning. He told Leo that he had truly crossed a line today by being so blunt about the situation. Mr. Miller's eyes were now bloodshot, looking as though they might actually pop out of his head from rage. He demanded to know if Leo was really planning to openly defy the leadership like this. Leo didn't even let him finish, cutting right through the man's helpless rage by asking if he simply didn't want him working there anymore. He pointed out that he was merely following the strict workplace rules that Mr. Miller himself had established. He was just doing his job, so what exactly was the problem? And if it really came down to it, he could just leave today and stop being a bother. Mr. Miller was so livid he began sweating like a madman while he kept ranting. The situation was becoming increasingly unstable, yet Leo remained perfectly expressionless through it all. The boss demanded to know exactly when the parts would arrive and when the machine would be operational again. Leo told him not to claim he had done anything wrong. Once the materials were actually on site, it would only take him 10 minutes to get everything running again. Mr. Miller turned to the procurement team, barking out a question about when the replacement parts would finally arrive. The response was grim. Even with express delivery, the machine components would take at least 3 days to get there. Mr. Miller's vision went dark, and he looked as though he might actually collapse from a brain hemorrhage right then and there. Suddenly, a sharp, fatal realization began to float through the gathered crowd of workers. They whispered that if they hadn't forced Leo to leave the previous night, they wouldn't be facing such a massive disaster now. It was true. In the past, he always arrived early in the morning to inspect the equipment for any hidden dangers. Because of his diligence, this broken machine had never actually stopped running until today. And yet, Mr. Miller had docked $5,000 from the man's hard-earned pay just for being a few minutes late. To be honest, it was a deeply inhumane way to treat someone. Mr. Miller shot the workers a fierce, threatening glare, and everyone was so terrified that they immediately stopped talking, hardly daring to even breathe. But once the floodgates of public opinion had opened, the entire atmosphere in the workshop began to shift. Everyone knew the truth. Mr. Miller had stolen $5,000 from a man's paycheck over a mere 2-minute delay. Ultimately, he had forced a master technician to simply give up and walk away. We see now that the very soul of the workshop actually rests in Leo's hands. They wondered when the parts would arrive, staring at the broken machines as if they were nothing but scrap metal. Looking at Mr. Miller, one could almost see the steam rising from his frustrated head. Leo slowly took a long, relaxed stretch and reminded Mr. Miller that the rules strictly forbid gossiping during work hours. He calmly stated he needed to get back to his station and asked to be notified whenever the parts finally arrived. With his hands in his pockets, he walked away with a relaxed, swaying gait, looking entirely unbothered. He looked for all the world like a retired old man taking a casual stroll through the workshop. He left Mr. Miller standing there alone, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of purple. With the calm focus of a surgeon, Leo began meticulously maintaining all the other machines in the shop. To anyone else, those piles of junk looked like a disaster waiting to happen. But in his hands, they had to be obedient, especially with the end-of-year rush forcing everyone to work frantically. The machines were now spinning 24 hours a day without a single break. Naturally, the components were wearing out quickly, especially since there was no regular maintenance schedule in place. If problems didn't arise under these conditions, it would have been a literal miracle. In the past, when things broke down, the crew relied on sheer adrenaline to keep going until they were dead tired. Anyone who got sleepy or couldn't keep their eyes open was simply left behind in the rush. But Leo would be up in 10 minutes, acting like a protective older brother to the entire crew. Even if he hadn't slept for several days and nights, he remained the pillar of the operation. He would never let the production line stop for even half a second, no matter the cost to himself. Deep down, Leo always felt this was his true calling, a responsibility he simply couldn't escape. The rest of the crew was forced into endless overtime, and by the end, they were drowning in resentment. To put it bluntly, his old self was the only one willing to endure it, forcing himself to keep these machines running. He was more familiar with those gears than a devoted father is with his own child. A young apprentice from the next station leaned in secretly and whispered, "Leo, are you really planning to leave? Are you really staying here like some kind of living saint?" The boy asked, clearly worried. After everything that happened this year, the mid-year bonus had essentially vanished into thin air. Leo just kept working, listening to the rhythm of the neighboring machine as he adjusted a dial. A dull thudding sound vanished instantly, prompting the boy to ask if he had already found a better place to go. Leo gave him a knowing look, suggesting they take it one step at a time. Some secrets aren't meant for the workshop floor. If the truth about the scandalous price the boss refused to pay got out, this entire factory would likely explode. Exhausted and drained, the crew finally reached the end of another grueling day. Just a second before he was set to clock out, the long-awaited replacement parts finally arrived. A colleague shouted at the top of his lungs, "Leo, the materials are here. Machine number 3 is saved," he cried, but Leo didn't even bother to look back. The workday was officially over, and the moment the words left his lips, he moved like a sprinter in a race. He rushed to the time clock, and the very moment the green light flashed, he felt a surge of relief. His mood was excellent, knowing he'd earned a significant bonus tonight, though he still looked at the place with a bit of disgust. He wiped the thick, black grease from his palms, finally feeling like a human being again. Anything else would have to wait until he clocked back in tomorrow morning. The warehouse manager stood there, completely dumbfounded by what he was seeing. Apparently, the director had issued a final, non-negotiable order. The work had to be done tonight, but Leo had no intention of staying after hours. He wasn't about to work for free. Our protagonist had food deliveries to make to earn extra cash. Otherwise, he'd be eating nothing but air for the New Year's celebration. A group of his co-workers watched him walk away, desperately trying to hold back their laughter. There was a collective sense of relief that someone finally dared to stand up to the boss. As the sound of his boots faded against the workshop floor, the other employees shifted restlessly. They whispered that Leo was a real man, someone who clearly didn't fear the consequences. At that moment, the director poked his head out of his office, looking for his best worker. His face was so dark with rage you could have scraped the soot off it like an old pot. He demanded to know where the parts were so they could get the machines running immediately. When he asked where Leo had gone, the warehouse manager began to tremble with fear. He stammered that the parts had arrived, but Leo had already clocked out and vanished. The director roared at him to call Leo and bring him back this instant. By now, the poor warehouse manager looked like he was about to burst into tears. But it was too late. Leo's electric scooter was already zooming down the road at full speed. He had mentioned he needed to deliver food to save up some money before the holidays. The director was livid, wondering who exactly was in charge of this factory anymore. To make matters worse, the sales department had just issued their own urgent final demand. The client was scheduled to arrive for the inspection at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. The director's face shifted from a deep, bruised purple to a sickly shade of gray. He looked like a ghost, knowing that if the client saw machine number 3 sitting idle, the entire order would be lost. Leo's earlier defiance was the only thing giving him pause now. The breach of contract penalty was so high that even selling the factory wouldn't cover it. His legs began to tremble, and he collapsed against the doorframe, praying Leo would return tomorrow. Could he actually fix it? The director swallowed hard, realizing it was his only hope. Perhaps, he thought while gritting his teeth, he could punish Leo if he slacked off tomorrow. He started to mutter a threat, but his bravado deflated instantly, like a punctured balloon. No, he realized with a helpless sigh, he couldn't afford to provoke this firebrand again. He knew deep down he only had himself to blame for ruthlessly docking Leo's pay. Taking $50,000 over a 2-minute delay was, to be honest, a bit excessive. He had treated the man poorly, and who wouldn't feel resentful after such treatment? Those thoughts felt like a poisoned blade twisting in his own conscience. The realization stabbed at his heart as he slumped into his chair, his throat gone bone dry. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his fault since Leo broke the rules, but the timing was terrible. Meanwhile, Leo was cruising on his little electric scooter, slowing down to grab some street noodles. He was watching funny videos and enjoying a cheap, ice-cold soda, a simple pleasure, really. His uncle and aunt had already gone off to make their own fortune with their new boss. With his phone on silent, he could only imagine the director's panicked, aging face. The director was anxious and furious, his mind a messy blur of regret and fear. It was, to be honest, entirely deserved for being so ruthless and stealing that money from Leo. We see that at Boss Williams' place, the equipment is new and exceptionally well maintained. Occasionally, minor issues arise, but they are always handled with ease. Leo finishes his shifts on time every day while still earning plenty of extra cash. Life was simply great. He headed back to the dormitory as darkness fell. It was already past 11 at night. In the distance, we see someone pacing frantically by the door, desperate for Leo to finally appear. He was told to hurry to the workshop to put out the fire as the client arrived last night. The sales team needed to see the finished product first thing in the morning. Leo noted that his working hours were long over, so they could talk tomorrow. He wasn't about to work for nothing, not a chance. He had just spent the night out in the cold wind, but he'd earned a good amount. All he needed to do tonight was turn on the machine. The director offered 200 more out of his own pocket. Suddenly, the director's voice rang out from behind, illuminated by the streetlights. His old face looked as pale as paper and quite pathetic, which was a bit of a shock. This old miser had actually come to block the door in person. Leo claimed he was too sleepy to open his eyes and feared being late the next day. He warned that he wouldn't tolerate another deduction, leaving the director with that final thought. Leo simply turned around and continued walking toward the dormitory. The director shouted that he'd pay $500 plus an extra day off tomorrow to finish the job. His feet stopped suddenly as he began to do the math in his head. He could fix the machine and still have a full day for his own private work. It seemed like a win-win situation, assuming the old man actually kept his word. The director followed him like a drowning man clutching at a straw, a rare sight indeed. We have to wonder why this corporate vampire had suddenly changed his nature. Leo scrolled through his phone and saw a mountain of desperate help requests in the workshop group. A cold smile played on his lips as the pieces started falling into place. After all that fuss, the entire team couldn't solve the problem and was forced to find him. He had been running around all day, and honestly, his bones felt like they were falling apart. The thought of his bed was tempting, so he deliberately raised his voice and kept climbing the stairs. No matter how much the director pleaded, Leo had seen too many empty promises before. He knew better than to let the hawk go before he saw the rabbit. There is nothing more annoying than someone pestering you while you're walking home at night, especially when that someone is a black-hearted manager like this one. The director grew desperate, offering $500 in cash plus 2 days off instead. He begged Leo not to leave, his voice trembling with genuine urgency. Leo's pace didn't falter. This old fox had truly been pushed to the edge of a breakdown. That superior, cold composure he usually wore had been completely shattered into pieces. Leo slowly turned around, repeating the offer of $500 plus 2 days off to be sure. He asked if the director dared to sign a formal agreement and leave a thumbprint right then and there. He demanded the deal in black and white immediately, offering to write the note himself if necessary. Deep down, he let out a cold, triumphant snort at the director's sudden desperation. He remembered how dominant the man had been back when he cheated Leo out of $5,000. Now that the tables had turned, Leo let out an exaggerated sigh and took a deep breath. His voice trailed off weakly as he complained about how the night had completely drained his energy. He claimed his legs felt like lead, acting as if he could barely even stand anymore. The director, Charlie, was so anxious he nearly cried, desperately pleading for Leo's help. He explained that the clients had already checked into their hotel in the middle of the night. They were waiting to see the machine start and the products delivered by 10 tomorrow morning. Machine number 3, however, was currently sitting there as useless as a dead weight. Leo asked if the man was really expecting him to put his life on the line for this. He told the boss that placing such a heavy burden on him was creating too much pressure. Charlie was panting like a pair of bellows, gasping for air while begging Leo to show some mercy. Finally, Leo told him to stop arguing and agreed to go see where the machine had failed. As soon as those words left his mouth, the colleagues watching nearby nearly broke into applause. They were genuinely excited to see someone finally stand up to the boss like that. To be honest, Leo wasn't the kind of cold-hearted person who would leave others in a bind. But he felt this was the only way to handle a boss who looked down on everyone else. Leo knew that sometimes you have to peel back a layer of skin before someone truly learns to respect technology. With that thought in mind, we see him make his way over to the silent machine number 3. The bustling crowd of workers parted instantly, clearing a path for him as if he were a visiting star. The massive machine lay there, dead and silent, looking like nothing more than a discarded pile of scrap metal. He crouched down, but before he could even touch the metal casing, a co-worker rushed over to give him the news. The man explained that several of them had been secretly struggling with the broken thing for 2 hours. They hadn't made any progress at all, and Charlie had been so anxious he nearly had an accident in his pants. The big bosses from the sales department had been blowing up the phones, asking about the machine 800 times. Leo couldn't help but smile coldly at the nonsense. He had seen this kind of terminal failure before. To be honest, it was exactly the kind of disaster he was used to handling. After all, wasn't he always the one they called whenever things went this horribly wrong? Upon hearing this, Charlie's facial muscles twitched violently in a mix of shame and desperation. Leo shone his flashlight into the machine's interior, and the point of failure was more obvious than a lion on a rabbit's head. The conveyor belt had been completely shredded and peeled away from its tracks. The entire shaft was misaligned. If they had forced it to run, the whole workshop might have been buried in the wreckage. It is no exaggeration to say that if he had arrived an hour later, the main central shaft would have been total scrap. He lowered his voice and cursed coldly, demanding to know who was blind enough to set the base incorrectly. The corners of the foundation hadn't been secured nearly well enough to hold the weight. The new apprentice was so terrified that he simply trembled and weakly raised his hand in confession. He explained that Charlie had ordered them to force the production and told them to just close their eyes to the risks. Leo's first priority was to get it running, but Charlie nearly choked on his own rage at the suggestion. He snapped at the apprentice to shut his mouth, asking if it would kill him to speak less. Leo didn't even bother to look at them. He simply raised his voice and began barking out orders. He called for number 8 and 12 wrenches, plus Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, demanding everyone move quickly. The workers around him reacted as if they'd been struck by lightning, suddenly full of frantic energy. They scrambled to fetch the tools, and the very second Leo grabbed them, he dove straight into the work. The noisy workshop suddenly fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sharp hiss of metal on metal. The sound of friction echoed as everyone held their breath, their eyes glued to the scene. We see his hands flying with practiced precision for 10 minutes, then 20. After 35 minutes, he was finished, his black gloves now slick and stained with heavy oil. He tossed them aside, tracing a curve through the air before they landed face down on the table. Charlie stood frozen by the workbench, looking exactly like a statue carved from solid ice. He couldn't believe his eyes, stammering out a question about whether it was actually done. Leo told him to press the start button. Charlie reached out with fingers that were shaking uncontrollably. He firmly pressed the button, and with a low hum, the massive machine roared back to life. Like a beast waking from a nap, it began to run as smoothly as a well-oiled clock. The sound of the engine was so silky and perfect, it was almost enough to make a man cry. The entire workshop went silent for 2 heartbeats before the room absolutely erupted in cheers. The men were laughing and shouting, declaring that Leo was nothing short of incredible. It was simply amazing. They told Leo that his skills made him the undisputed god of the workshop floor. Even the workshop director, a man who truly knows his craft, was left speechless by what he saw. He was practically gnawing on his lip in disbelief, finding Leo's hand speed to be utterly terrifying. In the entire industry, he had never seen anyone else capable of performing such a feat. Charlie was so overwhelmed with emotion that his legs gave out, and he nearly collapsed on the spot. He declared that if anyone dared to cheat Leo out of a single cent in the future, they would have to answer to him. From now on, he promised that Leo would have the final say over everything in the workshop. Leo merely glanced at him coldly out of the corner of his eye, unimpressed by the sudden praise. He told him to stop talking nonsense and reminded him to have the 2 days' worth of pay ready by morning. He demanded his $500 immediately, and he meant right this second. With trembling hands, Charlie pulled out his phone and sent the transfer right there in front of everyone. And so, on this night, the matter was finally and completely settled. Everything was running perfectly now, and as for the remaining repairs, Leo decided to take 2 days off, regardless of how much work was left to do. He nodded in satisfaction, having decided exactly how many days he needed for himself. It was time to clock out. His mind felt as though it were about to explode from the effort. He tucked his hands behind his back, looking for all the world like a man who had just finished a routine shift. Like a wise master moving with the flow of the universe, he calmly walked out of the workshop. Behind him, dozens of workers gathered together like a silent flock, watching his retreating figure with a newfound sense of awe in their eyes. It seems they were all beginning to realize that their future now rested in the hands of a living legend. To be honest, spending 2 full days on repairs like that is simply incredible. He spent the next few days sleeping in, finally waking up naturally without an alarm. With the sun high in the sky, he took a long, hot shower to start his day. He hopped onto his battered old scooter and headed down to the corner of the street. There, we see him happily devouring a bowl of hot, dry noodles. He washed it all down with a refreshing, ice-cold bean juice for just a couple of dollars. These were the kind of peaceful days where nothing went wrong and no one bothered him. He wouldn't trade this for a kingdom, though he did stop by a neighbor's to earn a quick 2,000. It was almost like a gift. He just touched the machine a few times, and it worked perfectly. The owner, a man named Bill, gave him an immediate thumbs up in approval. He told Leo that his hands were quite literally made of pure gold. Leo asked him with a dry smile if he was just trying to sweet-talk him. He joked that if the praise continued, he might just give the repair away for free. Once the side job was finished, he returned to his original factory to resume his regular work. And so, we find him sticking to his same old, reliable routine. But as soon as he clocked in and lifted his head, he noticed something different. He stood there, completely dumbfounded, as he looked around the workshop. Several unfamiliar faces had appeared, standing tall and looking far more professional than even the workshop director. They leaned in close, whispering secrets to one another. It turns out these were the heavy hitters, the big bosses he had only heard rumors about. The factory owner stayed home, recruiting new talent with massive salaries of $12,000 a month. Deep down, Leo couldn't help but let out a heavy, silent sigh at the news. This deal was truly expensive, especially considering the boss had just worked hard all year and stolen $50,000 from Leo. Now, he was using that money to hire these high-priced experts. To be honest, the boss, Mr. Chan, certainly knew how to play his cards and his abacus. It was just enough time to use Leo's hard-earned money to support them for 2 months. He felt a slight bitterness in his heart, though the feeling was fleeting at best. His own pockets weren't exactly empty, as he was bringing in $2,000 every night. That side income was absolutely crushing these so-called advanced mechanics by a mile. Since the newcomers had arrived to do the heavy lifting, he could be even more shameless. The more experts there were, the more openly he could slack off and fish for leisure. He couldn't describe how happy he felt as the workday finally drew to a close. At that moment, his muscle memory kicked in with perfect, practiced precision. He was the very first one to sprint toward the time clock near the restroom door. The pure joy of punching out exactly on time. Who could truly understand that feeling? But today, he didn't rush out the exit. Instead, he turned and went straight to the office. There sat the factory director, an old man reclining comfortably in his executive chair. He was savoring a cup of fine tea when Leo raised a hand and knocked on the door. Leo told Mr. Chan he had a question. The old man lifted his eyelids and waited. He wanted to know about that $50,000 year-end bonus from the last time. Leo asked if he could do him a favor and reconsider. After all, he was only 2 minutes late. Surely there was no need to be quite so harsh, right? Mr. Chan's face changed instantly, flipping like the pages of a book. In a single second, he returned to the persona of a leader who believes himself superior. He calmly picked up his cup and blew on the surface of his tea. He explained that reason has its own rules, and rules must be followed. Being late is a violation. It is written there in plain black and white. If he had forgiven him then, how could he possibly lead his team now? He told Leo he must understand his difficulties, staring at his face for 3 full seconds. Leo realized he had truly learned a lot. When they need you, they are subservient. But the moment they don't need you anymore, you are forgotten. The crisis had only just ended, and they immediately returned to this unpleasant posture. Suppressing the anger in his heart, Leo tried to negotiate for even a small portion. But Mr. Chan's skin was simply thicker than the steel plating on an airplane wing. He didn't even show a flicker of a change in his expression. He told Leo that his request was completely irrational. It was absolutely impossible to accept, so he might as well just send him away. Leo understood then. If the boss acted with such absolute lack of mercy, then he couldn't blame Leo for continuing to ruin his plans until the very end. The days passed like water, and another month slipped quietly away. Then there were the new, so-called great professionals. Their academic degrees could probably be stacked a full meter high, but their knees were far too stiff to ever bend, and what's more, they couldn't bear the thought of getting even a single drop of oil on themselves. As for the strange quirks of those old ratchet machines in the workshop, they hadn't the slightest clue how to handle them. With that little bit of theory, they could only keep up the act for so long. Whenever they encountered a truly difficult problem, their minds went completely blank. Usually, when there was dirty or exhausting work to be done, they still sent Leo to do it. He took his salary and did his job without objection. Besides, those newcomers still had that fresh, nervous energy, running around and acting quite diligently for the time being. Mr. Chan was lost in his own daydreams, thinking he'd hired a savior for $12,000. He believed he finally wouldn't have to look at Leo's face anymore. He walked through the workshop every day with his hands behind his back and a spring in his step. He was busy fantasizing that the factory would soon expand across the entire world. Leo, as usual, was short on cash. He clocked in on time and didn't stay a second longer. After work, he went straight to maintain the draft for his side project. He had tamed several machines, and his partner beamed with joy every time he saw him. At the start of the second month, the machines happily yielded the remaining $60,000. The money went straight into his account. These days of earning double pay were so comfortable, he felt like he was floating. But just when everyone assumed the new recruits were ready to take the lead, things took a turn. A destructive storm was quietly gathering strength behind the scenes. Mr. Chan had no idea what was coming. He couldn't even dream of how quickly his luck was fading. Reality was about to deliver a brutal wake-up call, and it wouldn't be gentle. Leo remained unshakable, clocking in and out exactly on time every single day. He felt that if he stayed even 1 second longer than necessary, he'd already lost. As it turned out, this illusion of peace and quiet didn't last more than a few days before it flickered out. That morning, right after he clocked in and stepped into the workshop, the trouble began. Looking up, he saw those expensive $10,000 machine engineers gathered together. They were all scowling at a single water pipe that refused to work. They had fierce, panicked looks on their faces, as if they had just seen a ghost. He walked over and listened as several of them crouched there, ranting frantically at the machine. They claimed the structural design of this broken machine was simply unnatural. They wondered how it could be so retro, especially since the screws were completely jammed and stripped. They demanded to know who caused this mess, after they had spent all yesterday afternoon tinkering with it. The more they tried to adjust the data, the more the entire system collapsed. They basically had no clue what they were doing. Standing in the back, we see Leo watching them. He could hardly keep himself from laughing out loud. To him, it wasn't retro at all. It was simply that these school-taught students were incredibly inexperienced. To be honest, it showed. They had clearly never encountered this kind of old-school, heavy-duty damage before. These so-called elites, boasting high salaries and impressive academic titles, were out of their depth. They seemed practically allergic to oil, and as for actually crouching on the floor to fix the machine, well, they wouldn't even consider it. Their best skill was standing to the side and pointing fingers. Our friend Mr. Chan crept over quietly and lowered his voice to a whisper. He told Leo that these experts had been struggling until 11 o'clock the previous night. Despite all their efforts, machine number 5 hadn't budged an inch. The director was so anxious that he looked as though his hair might start falling out. Leo found it quite amusing. For a monthly salary of $12,000, they couldn't even manage to get machine number 5 running again. It seemed the remaining $18,000 of their pay was just for show and bluster. And the final $2,000? That was purely for maintaining their poses. It was a brilliant observation. Leo almost burst out laughing right then and there. Regarding the breakdown of machine number 5, he knew with his eyes closed, just by the sound, that the main bearing was definitely dead. The lubricating oil inside had likely turned into a dry, useless cake of tar. He told himself he'd have to be crazy to offer his help now. To be honest, he wasn't that foolish. He felt that volunteering would be a lapse in judgment, given his current position as the office slacker. He was the champion of doing the bare minimum, and he wouldn't touch anything outside his job description. By now, his new workplace creed was practically engraved on his forehead. If a problem wasn't within his specific scope of responsibility, he wouldn't even lift a pinky to help. Leo waited until just after 10 o'clock. Suddenly, a loud and deafening explosion echoed through the entire workshop. The cement floor beneath his feet shook violently 3 times. Everyone in the workshop was instantly stunned into silence. Then, we hear a new employee. He shouted in a cracked, panicked voice, crying out in shock. He yelled for Mr. Chan, announcing that machine number 5 had just exploded. The sight of Mr. Chan sprinting out of the office was more frantic than Leo heading next door. To earn a quick bonus, he demanded to know exactly what was happening. He asked if they hadn't guaranteed just yesterday that the machine was fully repaired. The new employee was pale with fear, his lips trembling uncontrollably. Frantically searching for excuses, he claimed they followed every procedure during the repair. They turned it on and adjusted the parameters, but then, suddenly, the machine went haywire. In a single second, machine number 5 had ground to a catastrophic halt. One has to wonder if they have brains at all. Mr. Chan was so angry his eyes were bloodshot, looking as if he might collapse right onto the motherboard. The director was sweating buckets, rubbing his forehead. Without Leo there to take charge of the situation, they simply couldn't keep things under control. Mr. Chan's expression was so grim, it looked like a storm cloud about to burst. He snapped his head around, directing a sharp, knife-like glare straight at Leo. Leo happened to be walking by holding a large wrench, staring blankly at the ceiling, completely devoid of emotion. To him, the chaos and the anger had absolutely nothing to do with him. Mr. Chan called out to Leo, ordering him to come over and take care of the mess. Leo simply replied that he was busy with his own work. Machine number 5 was no longer his responsibility. Mr. Chan choked on his words, nearly gagging in his sudden, sputtering disbelief. His face turned a deep, bruised shade of purple, looking very much like a moldy eggplant. The new hires, despite their high salaries, were now as pale as death itself. They looked as if they desperately wanted to find a hole to crawl into and disappear. And yet, one of them decided to be stubborn, refusing to admit defeat just yet. He told Mr. Chan not to worry, insisting that they would try to fix it themselves. As the young man reached out, his finger trembling, he pressed the start button once more. A terrifying, soul-wrenching metallic screech echoed through the workshop, making everyone flinch in unison. This time, there wasn't even smoke. The machine immediately tripped the high-level overload protection. A deafening grinding sound, like a dying animal, filled the workshop with a terrifying resonance. The color drained from Mr. Chan's face instantly, leaving him looking like a ghost. His lips trembled as he urged them to hurry. To be honest, he was clearly panicking. He reminded them that the professor was already waiting for the shipping order for Machine 5. The older worker standing to the side in total despair, knowing it was completely over. The massive workshop fell into an instant silence, with an atmosphere as oppressive as a funeral. Dozens of eyes turned toward Leo at the same time, all waiting for him to break the deadlock. A few of the rookies stole glances at him from the corners of their eyes. Their gaze was full of desperate pleas for help, as they realized they were truly finished. Mr. Chan's previous arrogant and pretentious attitude had completely vanished, replaced by sheer desperation. The tension broke as Mr. Chan approached Leo, his voice now as soft and buzzing as a tiny mosquito. He begged him to just take one look, but right at that very moment, just as Leo was about to speak, the phone in his pocket suddenly vibrated twice. He slowly pulled it out to check the screen. It was a message from the big boss himself. The message read, "Leo, come over early tonight. I've prepared a top-tier seafood dinner for you." The boss continued, "As long as you are in the workshop, my heart is finally at peace." Looking at the screen, the corners of Leo's mouth curled up into a wild, satisfied grin. On one side, people were crying and begging for salvation. On the other, he was being treated like a god. He was being worshipped like a deity on an altar, and this contrast between ice and fire was truly something. It was so incredibly satisfying that it felt as if his soul were soaring. He slowly raised his head. Looking at Mr. Chan's anxious face, a man who looked ready to burst into tears, Leo finally spoke. He calmly asked why Mr. Chan was coming to him for help now. After all, didn't they just hire those highly educated, elite senior technicians to replace him? In such a minor situation, he suggested that Mr. Chan should really be asking them for permission instead. Mr. Chan's Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed a very large, bitter mouthful of pride. The rookies felt as if they'd been publicly slapped, their faces turning as red as a monkey's backside. Mr. Chan's defenses finally collapsed entirely. "Leo, I'm begging you," he pleaded desperately. He admitted that only Leo had the skill to make machine number 5 work again. Leo watched him with a cold, detached expression, remaining silent for 3 full seconds. He knew that with people who discard others so easily, he had to take this chance to make them pay. They would never learn to respect the craft. Leo took a deep breath, his eyes turning cold and sharp. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air. "Mr. Chan, remember our last meeting in the office?" He reminded him that the factory rules were supposedly the most important thing. Since those rules were set, they should be followed strictly. Besides, we see that machine number 5 wasn't his responsibility at all. If he were to interfere with that specific machine now, it would be outside of his designated duties. It wasn't his shift, and it certainly wasn't his job anymore. That wouldn't be appropriate, would it? Mr. Chan's face turned as white as a sheet of paper. Leo simply tucked the schedule into his pocket. He went back to his own tasks. While machine number 5 was causing absolute chaos nearby, Leo's heart remained as steady as an old dog, without a single ripple of worry. He was just a simple worker. He arrived on time, took his pay, and did his job, tending only to his own small corner of the world. The rest of the broken mess didn't concern him in the slightest. After finishing his rounds, he stayed in his workspace until 5:30. When the final bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day, he transformed into a man on a mission, determined to be the very first one out the door. To be honest, watching him time his exit with a stopwatch, he couldn't have been any happier. He hummed a little tune, feeling sweet. Meanwhile, those elite technicians earning $12,000 a month, well, they were pulling their hair out. They couldn't understand why the parameters were breaking again. They kept insisting they had adjusted everything themselves, yet they couldn't find where the problem was. They were completely numb, their brains buzzing. The workshop boss was as anxious as an ant on a hot pot. And this is what they called repairing the machine. Those high-achieving students were terrified, their faces turning pale as they told the boss they had truly done everything they possibly could. They claimed they had done everything possible, but we see that this scrap metal could be fixed with one's eyes closed, simply by listening to the sound. They were like children playing games, unable to fix a thing. Mr. Chan stood there, paralyzed with fear, the corners of his mouth twitching uncontrollably. But Leo was nowhere to be found. Once the workday ends, even if the King of Heaven himself asks, he is going home. Without extra pay, expecting him to work for free was nothing more than a pipe dream. He rode his battered little scooter against the evening breeze, speeding away with a sense of freedom. Deep down, he felt completely at peace. Around 9 that night, we find the older workers sitting in the boss's spot, sipping hot tea while Leo adjusted 2 machines until they were perfectly obedient. His colleague, Mike, asked if this godlike skill was inherited, as it seemed almost like magic. The machines were now steady as a rock. Leo told them to head home early and not to overwork themselves. As long as he was there to give them a quick tune-up, Mike's heart could finally be at ease. The entire month's success depended on Leo's skills to ensure the orders were completed without a hitch. With a smile and a wave, Leo lowered his head and went back to his quiet work. Just as he was drying his hands, his phone began to vibrate wildly, as if it were possessed. He pulled it out and scanned the screen, which was flooded with frantic messages from the workshop group. It was over. Machine number 5 was dead. This time, it seemed, for good. Not a single light would turn on, and the production line was spitting out nothing but ruined screens. The customers' phone calls were exploding, demanding answers as if their very lives depended on it. The factory director was smashing mugs in his office, terrifying everyone within earshot. The finance department had just finished running the numbers, and the estimated loss was staggering. $1 billion? He nearly spat his hot tea directly onto the screen at the sight of that number. Even if they pooled an entire year's worth of profits, it wouldn't be enough to plug such a massive financial hole. He blinked twice, scrolling through his phone to watch the chaos unfold as machine number 5, which handled all the high-value orders from Korea, remained stubbornly stuck. It was a total bottleneck for the rear production lines, and the goods produced over the last 2 days were nothing but industrial trash. The client had exploded, sending a legal threat straight to the director's face. Leo couldn't help but laugh out loud right then and there. As he lay his head on the table, he shook with amusement. This wasn't just a broken machine, it was a total nuclear meltdown. They shouldn't have looked down on his skills back then, to be perfectly honest. He had only been resting for a few days, and the factory had already lost a fortune on the floor. They were losing everything, and now Mr. Chan found himself unable to escape the spotlight. Truly, the universe has a way of coming full circle. This is what happens when you underestimate a genius. At 11 that night, riding his little electric bike, Leo slowly made his way back toward the dormitory. He saw that the entire factory area was as bright as day, with everyone gathered around. Machine number 5. A group of desperate people stood there, surrounded by the smell of money burning. Those poor souls were working with bloodshot eyes, fighting tooth and nail to fix the impossible, and even Mr. Chan, who usually looked down his nose at everyone, had his sleeves rolled up at the base. Just as Leo was passing by the door, someone with a sharp eye shouted at the top of their lungs, calling him a living ancestor and begging him to come inside and save a life. But he didn't even look back. He had no time for that. His workday was already over. He had just finished his food deliveries for the night, and his bones felt like they were practically crumbling. Someone begged him, "Leo, please. Mr. Chan is on the verge of a total breakdown. He is completely losing it." But the man's madness wasn't his problem. He didn't stop walking toward the dormitory, leaving behind a scene that looked like a literal industrial hell. Some people were half buried inside the machine, poking around blindly, while others simply collapsed and threw their chairs in frustration. The director was clutching his head tightly while squatting on the floor, questioning his very existence. Mr. Chan sat on a spare parts box like a pile of rotting mud, his eyes vacant as he repeated nonsense to himself. Leo couldn't help but admire this beautiful disaster. For a second, humming a tune as he headed off to sleep. Speaking of which, he really had to thanked the man for withholding his pay and forcing him to find extra work. The money he made these past 2 months far exceeded that measly year-end bonus. This year was certainly going to be a prosperous one, and he knew better than to let others take advantage of him again. Just as he pushed open his dormitory door, before he even had time to untie his shoelaces, he was hoisted into the air by several desperate men. "Leo, please," they cried. "Have mercy and save us. That dog Chan has made a terrible threat. If machine number 5 wasn't fixed, everyone's year-end bonus in the entire workshop would be reduced to 0. He hung there in the air, momentarily stunned by the news. Collective punishment. How? Utterly poisonous. The men holding him up were all old friends he had worked with for years. In this moment, everyone's eyes were bloodshot and desperate. The refusal he had prepared died in his throat as he looked at those weary, haggard faces. They were on the verge of collapsing and bursting into tears. Deep down, Leo felt his resolve to walk away begin to soften. He knew all these men depended on this money to survive. Some were waiting for that cash just to buy New Year's clothes. Others had mothers-in-law expecting a traditional red envelope. To be honest, the pressure of family expectations was a heavy burden. No one understood better than Leo how vital this life-saving money truly was for people like them. These blue-collar workers labored hard all year long, and it wasn't just for the sake of a modest year-end bonus. One man begged him to help, explaining that Mr. Chan had issued a final, lethal ultimatum to the entire crew. If they couldn't convince Leo to help, everyone's hard work would go to waste. Hearing this, he almost couldn't help but laugh. It seemed the young manager was trying to play a very dangerous game with him. A bold move, certainly. Stealing Leo's own money wasn't enough. Now Chan wanted to break everyone's rice bowls just to force Leo's hand. It was truly disgusting. It was as if the man was personally opening the door to a pit of despair for everyone involved. When Chan had slapped the table and stolen $5 from him before, it clearly hadn't been enough to satisfy his greed. And now we see the result of that arrogance, as the situation with the machinery had spiraled completely out of control. Everyone knew the stakes were high. This was the emergency that had been brewing for quite some time now. Leo looked back at the workshop, thinking of the poorest souls among them who would suffer the most from this madness. He considered returning to the floor without even taking a moment to rest or open his own door. The weight of their collective fate was now resting squarely on his shoulders, a heavy burden for a tired man. He looked at the faces of his colleagues, seeing the raw desperation in their eyes as they waited for his answer. They were seeking compensation for their toil, caught in a trap set by a manager who treated them like pawns. One brother cried out that if he didn't receive his bonus, his wife would surely kick him out along with his luggage. He pleaded with Leo, telling him that he was now the only hope for the entire workshop. Hundreds of fathers and their families' lives were at stake. After a long silence, we see Leo looking at this group. These sturdy men, their eyes red with desperation, were looking at him as if he were a living deity. His heart suddenly tightened. In a group, rules are rules, and he had already finished his shift. He had just finished delivering food outside, and to be honest, life was really not easy for him either. Holding on to his last bit of resolve, he spoke again, telling his brother not to act this way. But this time, the men were truly in a desperate situation. If the machine remained broken, everything would be lost. The year-end bonus would vanish into thin air, and that was only the beginning of their troubles. It wasn't even clear if next month's basic salary could be paid. Leo took a deep breath. Deep down, he really wanted to let Mr. Chan suffer the consequences, but he couldn't let these poor men go down with him. He patted the dust off his trousers and suddenly stood up, signaling it was time to go. The group of workers erupted instantly, overwhelmed with an emotion that was almost impossible to contain. They treated him like a savior. Inside the workshop, the atmosphere felt like the end of the world. Panic filled the air as people shouted not to pull the power cables. It seemed everything was over. The fire couldn't be contained. Men were swearing and crying out for help as the situation spiraled. Toxic smoke began to pour out once again. It appeared the machinery had finally burned out completely. Everything was being scrapped, and the workers felt as though they were all facing ruin together. The workshop foreman clutched his bald head tightly, crouching in the corner in utter defeat. The factory director, who used to act so superior, was now sitting in the trash with his eyes rolling back. He was mechanically reciting numbers like a madman, obsessed with the millions he was losing. He cursed his bad luck, barely holding back his rage as he finally lifted his head. Suddenly, the workshop foreman rushed toward Leo as if he were seeing his own mother in the middle of the night, his face flushed with excitement as he practically crawled and knelt before him. He hailed Leo as a savior, using such exaggerated praise that it nearly made our hero gag. Leo reminded them he had already finished his shift and was only staying to take a quick look. The factory director took a deep breath, and for once, he didn't dare utter a single word of protest. Instead, he immediately switched into full sycophant mode, treating Leo with newfound, desperate respect. He bowed deeply, asking Leo to name his price, promising any amount of money he desired. He begged him to save the factory, even offering to bow 100 times right then and there. The workers watched as the director continued his desperate plea for help. He knew exactly how to beg when his precious machinery was on the line throughout the night. The sounds of the chaotic workshop resonated around them as Leo stepped forward. He wanted to know exactly what had happened during the failed repair attempt. It was enough to make his blood boil. This group of highly paid, useless supervisors had failed miserably. They had turned a $10 million machine into something fit for a scrap metal recycling yard. The precision screws were mostly missing, and the signal cables had all been plugged in backwards. The central alignment was miles off, and to be honest, it looked like a total disaster. Even the critical main shaft had been violently twisted into a tangled mess of metal. Leo couldn't help but point at the machine and curse, asking if they really called this a repair. To him, it looked like blatant sabotage, and the senior engineers turned bright red with shame. They stammered that they had done their best, but they had clearly been in far too much of a hurry. Knowing this mess could bankrupt the entire factory, Leo didn't waste another word and simply looked up. Suddenly, his cold gaze swept across the room as he called out for the number 8 and number 10 tools. He demanded the number 12 wrench, a high-precision calibration ruler, and a crosshead screwdriver. He ordered them to bring the insulated gloves and calibration tools immediately at the speed of light. Everything was delivered to him in less than 2 minutes, including the number 8 and number 10 wrenches. The number 12 wrench, the precision knife, and the calibration ruler were all laid out before him. With the insulated gloves ready, the set was complete. Someone even opened a bottle of mineral water. They respectfully handed it over, begging Leo to first moisten his throat and have a drink. Others fussed over the lighting, asking if it was bright enough for him to see his work clearly. One even laid down cardboard so he wouldn't be cold, making Leo laugh inwardly at the absurdity. Usually, these old foxes mocked everyone behind their backs, but now they were all rushing to help. They acted like devoted sons, changing their faces faster than one flips the pages of a book. Leo zipped up his work jacket, put on his insulated gloves, and crawled directly into the machine's chassis. Inside the belly of this aging machine, we see a maze of densely packed, delicate components. The cables were so intricately tangled that there wasn't even a clear gap to begin the work. Those rookies had turned the wiring into a total mess, leaving a disaster for Leo to clean up. It would take at least 3 minutes of intense focus as he settled himself deep into the machine's frame. The entire workshop fell instantly silent. Not a single person dared to draw a breath. Dozens of people stood frozen as if they had been paralyzed by some invisible force. They held their breath tightly, watching as he began the search for the root of the problem. We see him reach the calibration point. This kind of blind operation is something no textbook could ever teach. One might wonder who he thinks he is to possess such skill. It certainly wasn't learned watching his mother cook dinner. The factory director stood there as still as a wooden post, frozen in place by the sheer intensity of the moment. He didn't dare move even half a step, terrified that any slight noise might startle the man working beneath the machine. Leo, however, remained as steady as a mountain while lying there. To him, this was second nature. He felt he could handle this mechanical breakdown with his eyes closed. It was as simple as taking a drink of water. The wiring was twisted into a nightmare, and 7 core components had been completely displaced from their housing. Everything was off. Even the most basic sensors had been connected backward, reversing the positive and negative poles. It was no wonder the machine screamed like a stuck pig the moment they tried to run power through it. Those so-called experts had clumsily forced the temperature control cables into the wrong slots. A classic amateur mistake. Had he arrived a second later, the motherboard would have undoubtedly burned to ashes right then and there. If they hadn't brought him down from the mountain tonight, their violent dismantling methods would have ended in disaster. It was practically a suicide mission for the equipment, but Leo worked with a frantic, focused energy to save it. He spent over 3 hours without moving. In the old days, this kind of grueling overtime was just a normal Tuesday. Someone finally spoke up, asking if Leo wanted to come out for a breath of air and a quick rest. He ignored the chatter and demanded they hurry up and bring him the night shift tools instead. Watching Leo's godlike precision was 100 times more thrilling than any Hollywood movie, even at 3 in the morning. The onlookers in the workshop were dizzy with exhaustion as Leo tightened the very last crucial screw with gritted teeth. Finally, his entire body slumped to the floor in exhaustion. The factory director let out a long, shaky breath of relief. The crisis was resolved, and as they prepared to power up the machine, the director reached out to help him up. With trembling fingers, the director pressed the green start button on the massive number 5 machine. In that singular moment, the entire workshop felt as though it were holding its collective breath. The engine stabilized and finally roared back to life. Leo, you are truly the god of mechanics. The workers were absolutely stunned by what they had just witnessed. It was almost too much to believe. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, they would have assumed it was some Hollywood special effect. $100 million order had been saved, and the relief in the room was palpable. Some of the staff couldn't handle the sudden release of pressure. They began dancing and crying right there. The director, Charlie, looked at the machine as if it were a long-lost child finally returned home. He told Leo that he had saved his life and the entire future of the company tonight. He declared that if anyone dared complain about Leo being late in the future, he'd personally handle them. In this workshop, Leo was now the man in charge, earning more respect than even the company president. Charlie promised that whatever Leo needed, he would get it without a single question asked. If he wanted a long vacation, it would be approved instantly. Anything at all was his for the asking. The director was so swept up in emotion, he was practically ready to bleed for the man. Leo was so exhausted his bones felt like they were crumbling, but he forced his eyes open for a moment. He quietly asked if he could finally have his stolen $7,000 annual bonus returned to him. Charlie reacted as if he'd been hit by a high-voltage shock, his eyes widening in realization. He became incredibly animated, insisting that he would return the money immediately, and not just the original amount. He promised to pay an extra $3,000 out of his own pocket and invest even more in Leo's future. From now on, Charlie treated him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for a patron saint. His ability to change his expression at the speed of light was smoother than a polished mirror. We recall how Charlie had ruthlessly docked $50,000 from the competition's budget. Back then, he was the picture of arrogance, but now his humble posture was truly something to behold. If only he had realized sooner that Leo was the stabilizing force for the entire factory. In that moment, he realized his previous frowning and doubt had been a complete lapse in judgment. Charlie's aging face turned various shades of red and white as the embarrassment set in. He didn't dare utter a single word of protest, forced instead to simply swallow his pride. Leo let out a wild laugh as he pulled off his oil-stained insulating gloves. He patted the director casually, telling him that everything was fine and the job was done. He announced he was going back to sleep, a move that left everyone in the room utterly stunned. Their jaws practically hit the floor. The man had literally just finished the repair. And now, he was simply walking away without a care in the world. Charlie called out, asking if Leo was really going to abandon them and retire for the night. He begged him to stay just a bit longer to monitor the machine's stability and parameters. Leo pointed out that his shift had ended a long time ago. He wasn't a workhorse, after all, and he had no intention of giving away his free time. Charlie's voice cracked as he hurried after him, practically screaming at the top of his lungs. Leo reminded him it was 3:30 in the morning, and even if it were earlier, that was still his private time. The entire workshop erupted in a laughter that nearly took the roof off. He had just begun walking down the empty, quiet corridor when suddenly, something happened. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor behind him. Just as he was about to turn the corner toward his dorm, Charlie, acting like a desperate lapdog, came running up, panting frantically to block his path. He was gasping for air as he stood there, pleading with Leo to listen to his solemn apology. He admitted everything was his fault, calling Leo a man of great vision and talent. He begged Leo not to be like him, claiming he was just a fool who didn't know what he was saying. He insisted that Leo couldn't possibly change jobs, promising that at the start of next year, he would definitely receive a promotion and a significant raise. As long as he didn't leave, Charlie was willing to agree to any conditions he asked for. Leo took a firm step and stopped right where he was. It seems our old fox had finally caught wind of the fact that Leo was planning to run. He truly believed that he couldn't go on like this, looking down at Charlie in the middle of the night. He watched as the man bowed his supposedly noble spine, bending over frantically in desperation. A playful smile touched the corner of Leo's mouth, though he didn't say a single threatening word. He simply asked Charlie who could ever really guarantee what the future holds. He suggested taking it one step at a time, words that made Charlie's legs turn to jelly. The director looked as though he might instantly collapse right there in the hallway. Leo dragged his feet back to his room, lacking even the strength to change out of his oil-stained work pants. It was as if the very marrow had been sucked from his bones the moment the job was done. He collapsed directly onto the hard bed, falling into a deep, heavy sleep instantly. He crashed onto the hard bed like a dead weight, and less than 2 minutes after his head hit the pillow, he was out cold. His snoring was loud enough to shake the heavens. The next morning, he suddenly bolted upright and grabbed his phone. To his horror, it was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. He was in serious trouble. Leo sprang out of bed like a reanimated corpse, completely panicked this time. He realized he was exceptionally late, and his heart began to thud wildly against his ribs. It felt as if someone were flooring the accelerator inside his chest, testing the limits of his endurance. He remembered how they had swallowed $50,000 of his pay for being just 2 minutes late before. Being 2 hours late meant he would surely be publicly fired and reported to the authorities. He would likely be nailed to the factory's pillar of shame and metaphorically whipped for his tardiness. But then, a brilliant realization dawned on him. Just last night, he had accomplished the impossible. Through his own sheer effort, he had pulled this broken factory out of a $100 million hole. To hell with it. After saving the entire company's fate, staying in bed until 10 was simply a matter of self-respect. Leo took his time stretching, washing his face, and brushing his teeth with leisurely care. He walked through the factory grounds like a visiting lord, having already made up his mind. He told himself that at most, they would point fingers and scold him, and he simply didn't care anymore. As he approached the factory doors, he instinctively pulled his phone from his pocket to check the time. Suddenly, a bank transfer notification flashed across the screen, catching him completely off guard. The numbers were so bright they nearly blinded him on the spot. It was a massive sum. The system showed a transfer of $20,000 had just been deposited into his account. The message attached was clear. It was an extra reward paid directly from the director's personal pocket. The message promised that his annual bonus, previously withheld, would be paid in full without a single cent missing. Staring at the screen, Leo froze for 3 long seconds, his body reacting far more decisively than his mind. He clicked confirm to accept the funds, pocketing the money with the practiced ease of someone who knew his worth. As for the grand promises of year-end bonuses, he wondered who could actually believe such talk anymore. He remembered all too well how quickly the director had cut his pay before, showing absolutely no mercy. He questioned how much sincerity there could really be in this sudden distribution of corporate welfare. Once you have climbed out of a hole, you certainly don't want to fall back into it a second time. He put away his warm phone and noticed the security guard at the gate watching him intently. It seemed as though the entire world was suddenly paying attention to his every move. He confirmed that the atmosphere among the staff had shifted entirely because of his recent success. After months of doing nothing, he had become the most important person in the factory overnight. He felt like a star, walking through the stages of the factory as if it were his own personal celebration. The guards stood at attention as he passed, and the daily grind of the factory continued around him. To the workers, the company was a massive machine, and Leo was now the one turning the gears. Even the guards seemed to treat him with a new level of respect as he walked by. He had never experienced this kind of superior treatment before, walking with his chest out and head held high. The moment he stepped through the workshop doors, all his lingering doubts and anxieties completely vanished. He realized that those 3 hours of sleepless work last night had been entirely worth the effort. In the distance, machine number 5 was emitting an extremely pleasant and stable motor hum. That steady sound was so beautiful it was enough to make the weary workers want to cry with relief. We see the workshop master raising his hand, as if saluting a king, or in this case, Leo. To the workers, it was as if they were witnessing the return of an immortal legend. The man practically knelt, exclaiming that Leo had finally emerged from his long night of work. He told Leo that as long as he was present, it felt like a great guardian was watching over them. And with that, the collective anxiety of the workshop finally began to settle. The master gushed about how Leo's skill last night had been nothing short of miraculous. Machine number 5, it seemed, had never been so obedient since the day they first bought it. The man offered a frantic greeting, even asking if he could fetch Leo a glass of warm water. He even offered to run to the cafeteria to bring back a mountain of fresh buns for him. He went so far as to claim that Leo's complexion today was simply radiant. Deep down, Leo couldn't help but let out a cold, amused laugh at the absurdity of it all. Just yesterday, these same people were looking down on him as if he were nothing. And now, here they were, acting like humble servants, practically kneeling and pleading for his favor. Suddenly, Charlie burst out of the office like a whirlwind, with tears of genuine emotion in his eyes. He pleaded with Leo to hurry, looking as though his savior had finally arrived. Charlie insisted that Leo come to his office immediately for a proper cup of tea. The irony, of course, was that Leo had actually arrived 2 hours late for his shift. When Leo asked if his pay would be docked, Charlie shook his head frantically like a broken wheel. He insisted that in this factory, a man of Leo's talent could never truly be considered late. To them, he wasn't just a technician anymore, he was a living legend of the trade. Charlie asked him what time he had walked through the door, or what time they should even consider his shift to have started. It didn't matter, of course. To the manager, Leo was now a man of infinite wisdom who could do no wrong. Charlie's heart was so full of joy that he looked as though he might actually float away. At 3 o'clock last night, the man had been just inches away from falling to his knees in desperation. But today, we see him practically bowing at Leo's feet while they sit in the manager's spacious office. Leo watched as Charlie, usually so high and mighty, humbly served him a glass of water. For a moment, Leo felt as though he were caught in a trance, wondering if he was simply daydreaming. Holding the blue porcelain teacup with both hands, he remained in the office, taking in the strange atmosphere. Charlie's cautious and comical behavior was almost absurd, as if he were holding a delicate explosive rather than a cup of tea. He told Leo that his work last night had single-handedly pulled the entire factory back from the edge of a cliff. This was a massive achievement, and Charlie had already reported the success to the big boss overnight. He explained that the leadership team had been discussing Leo's future, and they had reached a decision. From now on, those dirty and exhausting tasks on the workshop floor would be a thing of the past. He wouldn't have to touch the heavy machinery at all, though Leo wondered what trick this old dog was planning now. He suspected they might be planning to use his skills one last time before tossing him out the door. Charlie leaned in close, a flattering and almost desperate smile plastered across his face. He acted as though he personally owed Leo a fortune, his eyes wide with forced sincerity. His only daily task now was to pull up a chair and keep a watchful eye on the machines as they ran. As long as Leo was sitting there to control the situation, everyone in the factory could breathe a sigh of relief. It was like a sedative for the staff, and Charlie promised that his compensation would be raised to the absolute maximum. As for how much that raise would be, Charlie made it clear that it all depended on Leo's own words. He told him to name a number and promised not to haggle. Leo was left completely speechless by this shameless display. Seeing that Leo hadn't reacted yet, Charlie continued to frantically increase the stakes to prove his loyalty. He insisted that whenever Leo wanted to rest, he should simply submit a request for time off. Charlie promised to approve it with his eyes closed. If Leo had things to do at home and needed leave, He wouldn't even need to invent an excuse. He was free to walk out the door at any moment. If the weather turned extremely cold and they required his expert intervention, overtime would be calculated by the minute at whatever price Leo deemed fair. Regarding the matter of arriving late or the daily attendance logs, things were changing starting today. Charlie promised to put Leo's name directly onto the permanent whitelist. If he finished his work early, he wasn't to worry about a thing. Slipping away home early was now considered reasonable. In fact, it was perfectly legal, and if Leo wasn't comfortable sleeping at his desk during his lunch break, Charlie offered to personally go out and buy him a high-end, king-sized Simmons mattress. He even suggested bringing it directly into the workshop. Holding his steaming tea, Leo bit his lip. It was the only way he could stop himself from bursting into laughter right then and there. Charlie lowered his voice mysteriously, maintaining that humble and flattering expression. He practically begged him, calling Leo his younger brother in a desperate attempt to bond. He pleaded with him never to think about changing jobs or leaving the company again. Without Leo there as their guardian deity, this broken factory wouldn't survive another 24 hours. It would certainly close its doors. From now on, in this factory, if Leo so much as made a sound, it would carry far more weight than any order written in red ink. Leo took a slow sip of his tea and finally looked up at his boss. He asked if his $5,000 year-end bonus was safe this time. Charlie practically barked, asking who would ever dare to touch Leo's money. He swore he would fight to the death before allowing a single cent to be deducted. The deductions were gone. In fact, looking ahead to next spring, Charlie promised to double it to $10,000. Leo was now the most irreplaceable heart of the entire factory. While appearing calm, Leo was privately doing the math. As for that big project next year, well, we shall see when the time comes. A leopard doesn't change its spots, it seems, unless it learns a very painful lesson. Meanwhile, we hear the cheerful roar of engine number 5 returning to life. The backlogged orders were finally back on track, preventing massive losses and saving the careers of the high-ranking executives. Even the most demanding bosses looked good now. But Leo knew he had to stand his ground, even from a distance. As for his greatest desire at this moment, it was simply to enjoy his freedom. He was anxiously waiting for the clock to strike the hour so he could rush out to his beloved motorcycle. He planned to visit Mr. Wu to relax and earn some extra cash. He felt lucky to have such a good day. Only a fool would pass up an opportunity like that. And so the daily routine continued. He would clock in and out exactly on time. Even if the machines were literally smoking, he wouldn't stay a second longer than necessary. As for those grand, sweeping promises made back in the director's office, we should probably view them as the desperate delusions of a man in shock. Unless it is written and sealed, anything promised on a paycheck is just noise. Especially when you already have thousands in cash sitting right in your pocket. Leo was truly enjoying this heavenly routine, free from any forced overtime. Watching the machines run perfectly while the entire staff treated him with absolute submission. They treated him like a god, and deep down, he couldn't help but marvel at it. This was what it felt like for a worker to finally stand up and become the boss. Those arrogant rookies who used to look down on him were now hovering around him daily. He wanted that full dose of respect, with everyone calling him Big Brother with total sincerity. Take a break, Leo, they would say, noting that his energy today was simply incredible, as if he could tear through a solid iron bed frame with his bare hands. While they brought him water, the shop manager would sneak past his station like a thief, checking on him at least 3 times a day, terrified that something might upset him. Even a simple cough in the hallway would make the director react like a protective mother hen. He would come charging out of his office the moment he heard Leo clear his throat. He'd ask if Leo had caught a cold and insist he go home to rest for 2 days, even offering to personally drive him to see a specialist if necessary. Leo wondered why there was such a fuss. His throat was just dry from smoking too much. The director immediately spun around and began shouting orders at the cleaning lady. He barked at her to go and prepare a cup of ginger tea with brown sugar for Leo immediately. Leo wondered who was supposed to slice it thick for him, feeling completely overwhelmed by this magical turn of events. He could never have dreamed of such an absurd and shocking scene, not even if he'd been 10 times braver, just a single month ago. As for enjoying this imperial treatment now, he had become as accustomed to it as one is to drinking a glass of cold water. At times, a rather dangerous idea even began to take root in his mind. It seemed he could push them even further, perhaps becoming even more brazen in his demands. Then there was the matter of the promotions and the salary increases. The director practically went out of his way to drop hints in front of Frank every single day. He promised that as soon as the new year passed, he would increase Leo's salary immediately. The director claimed the amount of the raise depended entirely on Leo. He only had to say the word. He even offered to personally visit the finance department to oversee a special approval process just for him. That insignificant old salary, he claimed, was a genuine insult to Leo's incredible talent. We see him insisting that they must offer compensation that truly reflects the exceptional value of top-tier talent.